A couple weeks ago, after the talk, we got into kind of an interesting discussion, or the beginning of an interesting discussion around trauma. The topic of the talk was the way in which, in this practice, we investigate or we look closely at the suffering of others. And the question that was raised was, very simply put, is it appropriate to ask someone who has experienced trauma, who is still working with trauma, to do that? When they have so much suffering of their own, is it a reasonable demand, is it a reasonable expectation to take up the practice in that particular way? So I wanted to talk about that a little bit tonight, not exactly through the lens of trauma, but through the lens of privilege. There's a lot to be said about this, I think, and this may become a little haphazard. But a good starting point always is the Buddha. We've been talking about the Buddha's story a lot this month, and we're going to come back one more time to that beginning. When the Buddha stepped outside of the palace, he was the epitome of privilege. Everything was handed to him. Everything was taken care of. He was not expected to understand or recognize or grapple with suffering in any meaningful way at all. He had never struggled for anything. He had never wanted for anything. Nothing had ever hurt. He stepped outside of the palace walls, this embodiment of privilege, and there, for the first time, he encountered sickness, old age, and death. And it shook him to his core. It pulled the rug out from under him and set him on a path of spiritual practice and spiritual resolve. It's a beautiful story. So much of our understanding of all of this rests on that. It rests on that moment. Buddhism traces itself to that moment. And the way that we understand this tradition has all these little echoes of that moment. Not as simple as what he did, going out and suddenly just seeing the world as it is. But we have these stories in Zen, these koan stories, in which someone has the rug pulled out from under them. We love this. They encounter an abstraction, essentially, but one that's so shocking to them, so powerful, that all of their philosophical foundations no longer hold. And they have to start from a new place. I've been thinking a lot about this story this week in terms of privilege, and how the whole thing is predicated on the Buddha's privilege. The whole thing is predicated on a life that allowed him to be ignorant to a remarkable degree, so that the rug could be pulled out from under him. He needed to be in a privileged place to have that experience. And then that experience itself was a privilege in a way. And is. Because when you have the rug pulled out from under you spiritually, You're allowed, in a sense, to leap over pain to a spiritual discovery. When the Buddha had this experience, when he saw these things, he was not traumatized by them. He was not hurt by them. He did not feel pain. He just felt this kind of wow that made him change his life. He was fine. He was inspired. He was shaken, but he was fine. But people have pointed out over the years that, obviously, what was amazing to him was normal to everyone else. He was walking through a town, witnessing these obvious realities, and saying, "Oh my gosh!" No one around him was surprised at all. They knew this, and many of those people were suffering in the face of them. He saw sickness and had a kind of spiritual awakening. That's very different from the experience of the person he saw. He saw old age and again had the privilege of this waking up moment. It's very different from the experience of the person who was so old that it left him unsettled. What does this mean for us? I think first we have to ask ourselves how much we imagine that the practice looks like this. How much we imagine that the practice is one of abstract leaps. How much of it is having the rug pulled out from under you? Having an aha moment. Being able to laugh about it and say, "Oh, wow, now I get it." A lot. If we're not careful, a lot. I come to this as someone who, like Siddhartha, checks all the privilege boxes. I'm white, I'm cisgender, I'm straight, I'm tall, which helps. I'm educated, I'm male. And not only that, but nothing in my childhood was traumatic. So I arrive without trauma, I arrive without addiction, I arrive without any of these things. That might have inadvertently taught me about the nature of suffering earlier. And it's not just that I have these external privileges. It isn't just a lack of hindrances. It's that growing up, because I had these circumstances, I also had the benefits of these circumstances internally, which is to say, I had the confidence that goes with having doors open. When I went to a job interview, when I did an audition for a play, I wasn't that good. I didn't have a lot of skill. I didn't have a lot of talent. What I had was a kind of fearlessness. Not something earned. Just the absence of fear. Things had worked out for me up until that point. And when things work out enough, you start to carry yourself in a way that suggests they're going to continue to work out. And when you carry yourself in that way, people around you believe that things are going to work out. And then they work out. This is true of a lot of people in this position. It's not mysterious why most Zen centers and most Buddhist centers in North America are run by white men. We don't have to think about it for long. There's so many conditions that lead to that. Again, not just the lack of obstacles, but the privilege of having a certain kind of experience of the practice, a certain kind of discovery of spirituality along the way. Because nothing else was at stake. Not the way that it is if you're in poverty, or you're struggling with disease, or you're not safe. When those are your factors, when those are your conditions, you may not come to spiritual practice going after the gold ring of enlightenment. You may be looking for something else. Whereas the Buddha's discovery was that suffering exists. For someone who's suffering, the discovery might be simply that there is more to this life than suffering. That doesn't look the same. And what happens, I know, because I've heard these conversations so many times, is that we fall into an idea that there are people who are cut out for this and there are people who are not. There are people who are the right fit for this kind of practice, and there are people who are not. The people who can lean into the difficulty of the practice for the sake of that difficulty, because they're reaching for that discovery, look like a good fit. And the people who don't feel as safe doing that, maybe don't. I've heard it said over and over, and I've said similar things myself, that in the monastic practice, athletes do really, really well. It's not because they're bringing some spiritual depth. It's not because they're going to reach some spiritual depth. It's because through that particular process of mastery and of self-denial that is part of being an athlete, they're really good at the protocols of training. They've set a particular bar for what is hard and what is not hard. And so we look at those people and we say, oh, that person's really good at this. That person's a good monk. That person is a good nun. And once we do that, we start attributing spiritual qualities to that person, because they look good doing it. Some people don't look good doing this because they're suffering as they do it. This is a very long way to get to where I wanted to go. But I want to say this. If you're looking for something that cracks you open, this practice offers that. This practice will pull the ground out from under you. It's wonderful. But if you have already had the ground pulled out, if you are digging your way out of a hole, this practice can and should, must, also offer you that steady ground to stand on. Period. It should be a place of refuge. If you're someone for whom the world is not safe, this should be safe. If you're someone for whom everything is safe, this should not be safe. But there is no higher and lower. This practice should be equally challenging for every single person who comes to it. Because this practice is not a skill. This practice is not a skill set. It is an inquiry into, it is a confrontation with your life and your death. So if you ever catch yourself thinking, oh, she's really good at this, she's really suited to this, or if you ever catch yourself thinking, you know, this comes kind of easily to me, you're missing something. You're leaning into the part of it that's easy for you when you should be leaning into the part that's hard. There is no one to whom this path is not available. Not just sometime, not after some prerequisites are met, but now. It's open to everyone equally now. None of us are ahead. None of us are behind. We just come carrying different things. In some ways, I feel like I only have started to say what I want to say about this, but I'll stop there.